qualitative maps, just different ways in which we can show relative differences or things like that, and then we'll talk about how we can show different ways to quantify those things. So to start with, as you add data to ArcGIS, you may not have really thought about it or noticed it, but as data comes into ArcGIS, it's displayed as a single symbol. And so all the features of the data you added will draw in the same way. They'll be given the same color and a single symbol. If it's a point data like this, it's usually just a round dot, and then ArcGIS will randomly assign a color. So you may have noticed if you're looking at the person next to you, why is your dots blue and mine are pink? And that's because, what was that, like 2 minutes? Okay. Yes, I'm still using the system. Stop. That's ridiculous. Okay. I mean, how long do they think these classes are? Terrible. All right. So the ArcGIS will randomly assign a color. And why, for example, let's try to think yourselves, why would you use this method? Why would you use a single symbol for something? Why should you use a single symbol for something? Go ahead, Mike.
So basically, the one element you're trying to display is all the same, identified easily.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly. So if there isn't really a difference between any of the individual things that you're showing, you're going to want to show it as a single symbol. Otherwise, it's confusing, and you will confuse people if you're varying that symbol in some way and you're not trying to show something. So single symbols can be very important. All these streets, in this particular case, you just want to show streets, right? If you wanted to differentiate which of these might have interstate numbers, which some of these do, which of these are, sort of one-way streets versus two-way streets or something, you could categorize them. But if your goal is to not emphasize, just show where there are streets in Washington, D.C., then that would work just fine. This also, typically, you want to use single symbols for natural features. Right? This is, unless there's something specific you're trying to illustrate about the natural features, you want them in the background to just sort of be there. Right? Things like water should all be displayed the same way. So rivers would all be, or streams, all given the same kind of classification and shown the same way on your map. Now, we can display then another choice that we can show things is based on a unique value. So depending on our data, we can bring in data that has a spatial dimension so that we can put it on the map, and then it can have lots of associated data that gives you more information about everything that you're showing. So in this particular case, we have this map of New York City is divided up into different types of land use. So the data has a field for land use, and we can display separately each of these different categories of data. So unique values work well when we have different categorical data, something that we can classify in this way. And so in this case, these are polygon data, right? So they're representing areas. All the areas are given a different color based on what land use category they're assigned. You can relatively easily do that in ArcGIS, and really any GIS system. I mean, this is sort of basic stuff. You could change. You could adjust those colors. You could make groups. You could group them if you wanted to. So say you wanted commercial and manufacturing to be one color, everything else to be another color, to emphasize that. There's lots of decisions like this you can make in ways to bring out what it is you specifically want to show. And you can do this with single symbols, right? So in this case, we have two different changes being made to these point data. So these are point data in this case. They don't look necessarily just like points because they have a shape, but these are point data nonetheless. The shape size is relatively arbitrary. We want to set that to be something that's legible. Now, what are the two things that are changing about those symbols? The color and the shape. All right? It can be advantageous to do that. It can also needlessly complicate your map. All right? So depending, you need to make those kinds of decisions. Is it just as clear to just change the symbol, or is it just as clear to just change the color? There would be reasons to do both. You might not want to change both at the same time, but you can, right? Changing both at the same time really emphasizes the differences between that. But if you wanted to group, say, different areas or different other kinds of things, you could decide to do all the same kind of symbol, just different colors, or different symbols with the same color. So in each case, there's going to be advantages and disadvantages to that. I sort of mentioned that, but what's the big advantage to changing the two things about the color and the shape?
Just really stands out.
Yeah, it really stands out. So yeah, if you really want to make it clear, particularly if you have a lot of overlapping symbols, that can be helpful because you can start to pick them out. If they were all the same color, they would really blend together. Where they're especially at this scale. At this scale, those symbols might be a little too large because they're overlapping so much. So you can also adjust symbol size to try to show things as clearly as possible. All right, so let's look at some quantitative maps. All right, quantitative maps are where we're incorporating not just categories, but some other kind of data that's associated with that. All right? So in this case, we're putting features into classes, and how we divide that up, we'll talk about a little bit later. I didn't want to get too far into that, but we can divide them up into just different size classes. All right? And then the symbol size reflects the class values. And so why would we want to use this technique? What's the advantage to showing a graduated symbol like this? Yeah.
Densities or abundance.
Oh yeah. Okay. So different kinds of data. Yes, you could show densities or abundances, and they're in a sense kind of both changing. So showing two things: how big the houses are. We have two different kinds of data being changed here. So the darkness is we're getting more people in a household, and then the number of households is by symbol size. All right? Now, in this particular case, we're categorizing these by county. I think. Is that county? That may not be county. That may be some. Well, county or whatever. It doesn't really matter. In this case, you're showing a symbol for each of those areas. So, yeah, county is probably not right. That's Connecticut, so they're not going to have that. There may only be a couple counties in Connecticut. Anybody from Connecticut? How many counties are in Connecticut?
I have no idea.
More than 5?
I think probably 5, honestly.
Okay, so those
maybe 1.
So those are probably something else, either like townships or census tracts. They may be census tracts actually. Although if they were census tracts,
Like I live in Fairfield County. That's like all that on the left.
Okay.
There's like 100 or 120.
Yeah, but Connecticut is
Yeah.
a tiny town. There's not that many.
George, there are 8.
There's 8. Okay.
That's
8.
Yeah, 8 counties.
Those are probably just townships.
Yeah. So what?
Townships.
Townships. Yeah, that's what I'm thinking. Townships.
Those are towns.
So they probably correspond some to towns and just sort of surrounding areas around that. Doesn't really matter what they are. But in this case, we're using a single symbol to represent the total data that's within that township, let's say. And so this works very well at this scale because the dots all fit essentially within that. It's scaled nicely. It's fairly clear. It's pretty easy to pick out differences in density. You can see, you can see where there's larger households and also more households. And so out here we get actually pretty small average household numbers of households. The smaller the dot, the harder it's going to be to differentiate these colors. And these colors are potentially a little too close together. So we'll talk about that in just a minute. So what we have shown here is what is called a choropleth map. And you may have noticed that word in the chapter. How many people noticed that it talked about choropleth maps? All right. So this is going to be something we'll talk about the rest of the semester, basically. It's likely some of you will employ choropleth maps for your project, just because it's just a colored map. That's all it really means, is it's a colored map. In this particular case, it's showing the percent of uninsured people by county for the entirety of the continental U.S. And so these are from 2005. You can see some pretty significant differences across the country, right? There are higher, the farther west you get and south, the higher the percent of the uninsured becomes. And in this case, the color scheme is using two different colors, which helps really show the difference. All right? Typically, for one variable, we'll get to that in a second, but typically this is a little unusual, but they're really trying to emphasize the difference between the lower values and the higher values, so you can really pick that out. Typically, when you have a single variable like percent uninsured that's relatively continuous, just increasing, you would use a single color and then change the saturation on it to indicate that. But there are reasons to make different kinds of decisions. That's one of the things I want you to start thinking about, is why we display things in other ways. We'll see a lot of U.S. maps like this. And one thing to always keep in mind is what is different, particularly east to west, if we're looking at a county map of the U.S. Size of the counties? Yeah, you get big counties out west, and you get tiny counties in the east. And so your eye is naturally drawn to these big areas. But in this case, it is percentage, which is useful. When you're showing a map like this, you almost always want to show it in terms of a percentage, because absolute numbers are also going to vary radically. There are counties out in the western U.S. that only have like tens of people, as opposed to counties in the east, which might have 1 million people in them. So there's going to be orders of magnitude difference in the size of the population or something like that. So percentage is very, scaling things to population size is really important if that's a variable you're looking at. All right, so let's